I'm very pleased to introduce Zachary Joachim, who is assistant professor at Denison University. His research focuses on the global history of philosophy, spanning late modern European philosophy and classical East Asian philosophy. Various old German and very old Chinese books, as he puts it. But I think the topic of his talk today is Mòzǐ's moral cosmos, and thank you for joining us, and looking forward to hearing from Zach today. Thank you for joining us, Zach, as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Joseph. It's an honor to be able to speak with you all today. I'm very excited for this to be a continuation of maybe some conversations we've already started through, collaboration we started between Denison and Ahmedabad. Sort of thinking globally about, I guess in my case, philosophy, and thinking sort of globally both about how philosophy is done in different places today, sort of different environments of philosophy, but then also, of course, the global history of philosophy. And one thing I really admire about your division at Ahmedabad is sort of the way in which philosophy is sort of very much built into, it seems, the humanities at large, but then also the study of language. And I think that kind of thing is crucial for doing kind of serious sort of global historical work on these texts, and sort of in a way that like genuinely diversifies the field. So it's really an honor to be able to present some of this material that I've been working on with you all today. So as Joseph mentioned, I do kind of modern European stuff, especially phenomenology, but then I also work on classical Chinese philosophy. And then sometimes people ask me like, so what unites these two interests? And I find that the only thing I have to say really is like either me, like I'm the thing that unites it, or just philosophy. Like I'm just interested in what philosophy is. But what that does mean is that sometimes, so I'm interested in what philosophy is, and I'm fascinated by like the concept as it appears in these two different sort of intellectual contexts. But one thing that means is that like if I'm sort of just following out an idea, like sort of following where it leads, I might sort of end up treading out a little bit further than my depth. So I think this might be the case here. So I'm sort of talking about philosophy of religion, ethics, which are not exactly things that I've worked on a lot, but they are. So I'm hoping that I can get that you all have some very good feedback for me and sort of thoughts that can help me make progress where I am with this project. And I should also say this is probably going to be a joint co-authored project between me and a colleague of mine who was at Denison last year, who works on metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and then also increasingly Indian philosophy. So this is kind of the beginnings of what'll hopefully be a co-authored piece. Okay, so we can just get into it. So imagine a world in which everything that ever happens to you happens for a divinely moral reason. Okay. So any good is God rewarding you for benefiting the world. Any bad is God punishing you for harming the world. Yet any bad is ultimately good, since it benefits the world, where benefiting the world, it all is all that God desires. Okay. So I think that's maybe, if not a naive idea, at least a kind of familiar idea, sort of an idea that at least for a lot of people can be initially attractive, but in essential outline, what you are imagining is the idea of a moral cosmos as it was thought by Mòzǐ. So kind of the world according to Mòzǐ, who lived around or who died in 390 BCE, and who is really the great the first great rival of Confucius, or Kongzi. So Confucius being unquestionably the most influential thinker in East Asia, Mòzǐ then being his first great rival. Okay. So this is his idea of the world. And in this world, nothing is ultimately bad. Everything's for the good. We always get what we deserve. Any appearance to the contrary is partial and short-sighted, right? It just means you're sort of not, you don't have the full context, or you're sort of not looking carefully enough, right? If you look carefully enough, you'll see everyone gets what they deserve. Everything is for the good. Nothing is ultimately bad, right? So reality is this perfect moral order, and thereby completely transparent, knowable, and predictable. So as I'll kind of talk about in a bit, there's a way in which this sort of very we could say, I don't know how the right word for it, but simple theology, sort of straightforward theology, which is very much also tied to folk traditions, sort of popular religious traditions of the time, is also being marshaled for a kind of scientific view of the world as well, where Mòzǐ is also going to develop on the basis of sort of the predictability or sort of transparency of the world, a kind of method for inquiry. So reality has this kind of perfect moral order thanks to heaven. In early China, heaven, it literally means like the sky, but also refers to the weather, the seasons, sort of celestial phenomena, natural phenomena, but is also where ghosts and spirits live. So both sort of ancestor spirits, but then also sort of, spirit of the valley or the forest or the mountains. All of this is in heaven. So just kind of comparison, Confucius kind of setting forth a standard for literate, learned culture, the kind of cultural elite. In the Analects, he thinks that heaven's activity is ambiguous, morally ambiguous, and only occasionally explicable as agency. Okay, so whereas Mòzǐ kind of has this kind of unambiguous moral agency, Confucius will say that there is an ambiguous agency. So I'll just show you some representative passages. So from the Analects. So the master Confucius says, one who rules the power of virtue is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in its place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. And then this one, the master sighed. Would that I did not have to speak. Zagong said, if the master did not speak, then how would we little ones receive guidance from you? The master replied, what does heaven ever say? Yet the four seasons are put in motion by it, and the myriad creatures receive their life from it. What does heaven ever say? So a few things going on here. So we kind of get a direct parallelism or sort of even assimilation between what it is to rule and what it is to be heaven-like or sky-like, where the kind of parallel in each case is that you don't deliberately make things happen. You don't speak your intentions. Your intentions are sort of, in a fundamental sense, actually not known, even to you. But it's by sort of occupying one's place, by a kind of spontaneity or sort of non-deliberate action, that sort of things fall into place. And this is exactly how heaven is. So heaven does not speak. Okay? Heaven does not have sort of discernible intentions that are communicated or expressed. And so too should the ruler be. Okay. So this is the ambiguity that I'm talking about. Okay, but then by contrast, Mòzǐ, sort of uplifting and defending the practices of sort of ordinary, non-literate culture, thinks heaven's activity to be agency through and through. So heaven's activity is the action of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-benevolent mind, ruling over all with transparent intention. Right. So heaven is a person, right? So who's omniscient, omnibenevolent, benevolent, and omnipotent. Right. So with Mòzǐ, we really get sort of the first articulation, at least in the written record, sort of philosophically elaborated concept of God. At least I would argue that. So it's true that before Mòzǐ, so there are lots of records of sort of divination that sort of treat heaven as a person. But only in Mòzǐ do we have an account of sort of who heaven is or what heaven is like, and arguments that sort of like support or that are reasons to believe that this is the nature of heaven. So really with Mòzǐ that we see this for the first time in East Asia. Right. So all of that I've said so far, I will be now arguing in a bit more detail, but sort of all this just kind of to introduce the main ideas. And specifically, I'm going to try to convince you of a few things. So first, that there's a distinct and more basic problem than the problem of evil, which I'm going to call the problem of imperfection. Mòzǐ is the first text to pose the problem of imperfection in East Asia. And this problem admits of a number of solutions, and some are better than others. And I'll be arguing that the most compelling are two different kinds of solutions. So I think in the abstract for the talk, I was sort of a bit more sort of conclusive in sort of advocating for one of these solutions as the solution, but after sort of working and thinking through it, I realized that I think there's sort of equal support for these two solutions. So here they are. So one of them is a conciliatory solution, where basically this is reconciling the existence of badness or imperfection with the perfection of heaven. Right? So those two can be reconciled. And the way that they get reconciled is that everything bad is our fault, not heaven's fault. And at the same time, we're vastly ignorant of the bad that we do. So that's the first kind of solution that I present as sort of textually well-grounded. But then the other solution I present is a non-conciliatory solution, which is to sort of say, yes, according to Mòzǐ, there are bad things, and yes, according to Mòzǐ, there should not be bad things because heaven is perfect, and we have to just accept this inconsistency. But that if we do accept this inconsistency and sort of see that it's a problem that stands in the text, this can then really help us explain what's going on in subsequent Chinese thought and what really becomes characteristic of Chinese thought, which is the rejection of God, or the rejection of a kind of person who sort of through a kind of top-down will creates and sort of regulates. This sort of idea just sort of falls off the map after Mòzǐ. Okay, so the plan is as follows. So first, I'll just sort of explain the problem of imperfection and its difference from the problem of evil, at least as the problem of evil is kind of standardly discussed today. And then I'll sort of talk about Mòzǐ's method of evaluating doctrines through which he gets the conclusion that there is no such thing as fate, but there are ghosts. That will then come in handy in sort of introducing the problem of imperfection, because the problem is basically that according to Mòzî's own doctrine, there is no such thing as fate, but then we have sort of kind of clear passage that seems to indicate that there is such thing as fate, or sort of things happening for kind of no good reason. And then I'll sort of walk through the different solutions. These solutions in italics are the ones that I think are worth spending more time on. And then the ones in bold are the ones that I will be ultimately advocating. Okay. So the problem of evil is often glossed as the problem of why bad things happen to good people. But if you sort of look at the literature today on the problem of evil, though this gloss is basically accepted, the discussion nonetheless centers on why people unjustly suffer, which is a more specific thing. And then sort of, so in so doing, the current scholarship obscures two distinct theological problems. And I should mention here, I'm really kind of relying on expertise and conversations with Justin Mooney, who I mentioned at the top of that he and I are working on this stuff together. So let God mean an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. So intuitively put, here is the difference between these two problems. Problem of evil: if God exists, why is there evil? Where evil is a specific bad thing, namely unjust suffering. And this is different than the problem of imperfection. I mean, we could just call it the problem of bad, but I think the problem of imperfection kind of sounds nicer. So the problem of imperfection is, if God exists, why is there bad? Any bad, right? So not just suffering, unjust suffering, but any bad thing, right? Why is there any bad thing if there's this perfect being, right? Why wouldn't everything just be perfect? So I think the story of Job from the Bible exemplifies the problem of evil, whereas the story of Eve and the sort of Garden of Eden exemplifies the problem of imperfection, right? So here we're sort of, so by contrast, I'm hoping to kind of tease apart these two different problems and sort of convince you that these are like conceptually and philosophically distinct. Okay, so here are some evils, right? Famine, disease, the maiming of children, death, genocide. But of course, there are lots of bads that are not evils. So there's sort of unwarranted but trivial suffering, right? Something that sort of seems like it could be evil if it were sort of a bit more intense, right? So like wet socks or getting a hangnail, right? So this kind of thing is sort of, you suffer a little bit, and you could say, you know, like, I don't deserve this, right? But it's not that it's evil, right? Or it's that seems like a little bit of an abuse of the term. But then we can also talk about wrongdoing, right? So it might be that you get punished for wrongdoing. It might be that you get away with it. It seems that we want to say that wrongdoing is bad, even if you don't suffer, right? So if you think about, you know, like, so our family dog, Bobby, often does what she's not supposed to do, which is jump up on the couch, which is bad, right? She's not supposed to do that. She's a bad dog for doing that. You know, so that's bad. That's a bad thing. Some sort of more intense bads would be defying God, right? Making pacts with the devil. That's bad, but it doesn't involve suffering. And in these last two cases, it's particularly important to note that these two, I mean, disobeying God and sort of making pacts with the devil, I mean, those are evils, right? And a kind of I think most people would say, yeah, like those would be evil, but they're not evils according to the problem of evil, at least as the problem is sort of today discussed. So I think this is a real problem for kind of the current discussion. It seems to have sort of narrowed in a kind of um, in a bad way. But then there are also aesthetic bads, right? So looking ugly, sounding bad, tasting bad. These are bads too, which could but need not involve suffering. Right. So if we wanted then sort of now put the problem sort of perspicuously, in each case, we could sort of just put them as inconsistent triads. So meaning that these are three things that cannot all be asserted or believed, where you have to sort of deny one of them. So the problem of evil would be, so God exists. If God exists, then no evil exists, but evil exists. The problem of imperfection goes, God exists. If God exists, then no bad exists, but bad exists, right? So to solve the problem, one of these three has got to go. We've got to deny one of them, right? Okay. And then just a further claim, kind of claim of priority. So if you solve the problem of imperfection, you thereby sort of solve the problem of evil. You sort of get a solution for free, but not vice versa, right? Okay, so that just conceptually is the problem of imperfection. Now let me turn to Mòzǐ. So Mòzǐ has this kind of doctrine of how to evaluate doctrines, like kind of meta doctrine, which is also basically the first scientific methodology in China, East Asia. So according to Mòzǐ, there are three criteria for believing a doctrine or believing a pronouncement. So first, is it observed by sort of everyday people? Does it have its sort of source in sort of everyday perceptions? Second, is it attested by history and what the sages did, right? Do our books talk about it? Do sort of our sort of through our oral history, do we sort of hear tell about this being the case? And then third, is it beneficial when followed? So is this a kind of doctrine that's actually used, that's sort of put into practice if we sort of look around, right? These are the three sort of tests or sort of marks of a sort of solid thing to believe or a solid thing to teach. So in the Mòzǐ, the sort of text in which we find Mòzǐ's teachings, he has like a few kind of clear applications of this method, where he's sort of very clear that the reason that he's arriving at these conclusions is that he's applying this sort of threefold criteria to sort of assess. And what's sort of striking is that through this sort of scientific methodology, he arrives at the conclusion that ghosts exist, but that fate does not. So what he says about ghosts is, you know, look, you just ask all the people, they say that they've all seen ghosts. We like look at all our books say that there are ghosts. And we think about, you know, would we be better off if we believe that there are ghosts who sort of watch over us and punish us if we do bad and reward us if we do good? Well, yeah. I mean, we'd be better off for believing that. We sort of look around and we see the people who have these sort of religious beliefs or sort of spiritual beliefs, they do much better than the sort of more, higher culture, sort of agnostic types. So we should believe that ghosts exist. Then he does the exact opposite when it comes to fate. So what he means by fate is basically sort of the idea that your lot in life is just sort of fixed. That, so, your fate is to just work this job, or your fate is to, never leave this town, or your fate is to never get a government position, right? So that's what he means by fate, right? Where it's sort of like this fixed thing that you can't change. And he says that that doesn't exist, right? So if we sort of go and look, like ask the people, sort of, have you ever seen this fate thing? Do you think that it actually exists? They'll say like, I like people talk about it, but I don't really ever see it. So then strike one there. If we actually look at the books, sort of our sort of like textual authorities, do they actually talk about fate? And Mòzǐ concludes, well, it seems like sort of recently we started talking about fate, but if we sort of go back to the real classical sources, there's no mention of fate at all. And in fact, I mean, it seems that the sort of sages and the sort of great cultural heroes did the great things they did largely because they thought there was no such thing as fate, that everything was basically in their hands, that they could sort of change. They had the power to change their circumstances, to change the world. And so it was by a kind of emphatic not believing in fate that sort of we got the sort of riches of culture that we have now. And then that sort of that then is another way of saying the third point, which is, we're much better off not believing in fate, right? So let's not believe that there's fate. Right. So this is what he means by fate. There's a kind of well-known expression. So fate in Chinese is Ming, and it sort of has a two-character expression, Tianming, which is usually translated as the mandate of heaven or the kind of decree of heaven, where the idea is that so if you are a ruler, you sort of are a legitimate ruler insofar as you've earned the mandate of heaven. So heaven sort of says, this is your lot in life, namely to be the ruler. You've sort of been appointed that. And so Mòzǐ sort of agrees that there is such a thing as a sort of divine right to rule or divine justification to rule, but he doesn't think it's anything mysterious or sort of opaque. What he thinks is that, okay, the person who ultimately becomes the ruler, as I said in Chinese, the Tianzi, the son of heaven, is just someone who like follows the moral law, right? So Mòzǐ is going to have a moral law, which is basically that like if you are benefiting people, you're doing the right thing. If you're harming people, you're doing the wrong thing. So then the ruler is just the one who does that best, right? Who sort of exhibits virtuosity in doing that. So they then earn Tianming, which is not really a Ming at all, is not fate at all, but is sort of their own effort, right? And that effort it would be just the following of heaven's will or heaven's intent. Okay, right. Okay, so far I've kind of talked about how there is this thing conceptually called that we could call the problem of imperfection. And we've introduced some ideas in Mòzǐ. But now I kind of want to throw a wrench into that. So we've just said that according to Mòzǐ, there is no such thing as fate, right? There is no such thing as you just getting handed some cards where you can't do anything about it, right? Well, there's an interesting passage, sort of towards the end of the Mòzǐ, where Mòzǐ himself falls ill. Okay, and then this sort of then poses a real problem for thinking about not just fate, but also heaven's agency. Okay, so goes, our master Mòzǐ had an illness. Approaching him, Diabi inquired, "Sir, you take ghosts and spirits to be seeing, able to bring about misfortune and blessings. Those who do good, they reward. Those who do no good, they punish. Now, you, sir, are a sage. Why do you have an illness? Could it be that there is something no good in your words, or that ghosts and spirits are unseeing and unknowing?" Our master Mòzǐ replied, "Even if I've been made ill, how is it that my words are suddenly no good, or that ghosts and spirits suddenly unseeing? As for where people get ill from, there are many roots. There's getting it from the cold and heat. There's getting it from strain and exhaustion. If there are 100 doors and you only close one of them, how is it that a thief suddenly has no way in?" So I have a link to the Chinese here if people want to, for whatever reason, look at the Chinese. But so what's going on in this passage? Well, if Mòzǐ is a sage, right, that should mean that he basically is doing all the good things and so is getting all the rewards. So if heaven is transparently this way, that like you do good, then you get good things, you do bad, you get bad things, there's something sort of on its face puzzling about Mòzǐ getting falling ill, right? So we can sort of flesh out the kind of two factors that would be at play here by just calling them fate versus heaven's intent. So it seems that, like in this passage, against what Mòzǐ had been earlier saying, which is that there is no such thing as fate, he's now conceding that there is such a thing as fate, right? Or at least that there is some amount of fate involved in our lives. So putting this now a little bit more precisely, fate would be that factor of what befalls me, which is not heaven's moral response to my actions, right? It's just something, it just happens to me, right? It's not that sort of heaven gave this to me as a reward or a punishment. But then the flip side of that would be heaven's intent. So heaven's intent would be that factor, what befalls me, which is heaven's moral response to my actions. Right. So this passage from the dialogues in the Mòzǐ affirms fate, but the triads, which are basically the core doctrines of Mohism, and they're sort of right in the middle of the book, and there's sort of three versions of each doctrine that sort of scholars think they sort of come from three different sort of Mohist kind of lines, which then got compiled together. So you kind of get the same doctrine sort of written three slightly different ways. But in any case, just serves to underline the point that these are core. Like these are sort of like if you believe anything that Mòzǐ is saying, you believe the triads, right? If you're sort of following his thought. So according to the triads, there is no such thing as fate, right? So this goes against what the passage was suggesting from the dialogues. Now, there are kind of two different ways we could then, at this point, try to clarify what exactly the denial of fate in the triads amounts to. So you might think that it's saying there's no such thing as fate at all, not even a little fate, right? Which means that whatever happens to us is 100% heaven's intent, right? And 0% fate. Or you could take a more moderate position where you sort of read the triads, maybe also in light of the dialogues, and you say, okay, well, I think probably there's something less strong going on here. So it's not that Mòzǐ is denying fate, it's that he's denying fatalism. So he's saying that the thing that we shouldn't believe in is that our existence is wholly determined by fate, right? That it's 100% fate. That's the thing that he's denying, right? So we can call that, against fatalism versus just against fate, right? So these two different ways of interpreting the doctrine will be important as we're then assessing some of the solutions, right? Right. So just to kind of give you an overview, this is how the text of the Mòzǐ is structured. So we have the triads here. So the kind of core doctrines of relevance for us: heaven's intent, seeing ghosts, and against fate or fatalism, right? But then we have the dialogues, which are sort of in the style of Confucius' Analects, sort of Mòzǐ in dialogue with various types of people, disciples, all kinds of people. And that's where we get this sort of seeming concession that, that like you don't always get rewarded for good things. And sometimes even if you're a good person, bad things happen. And then, one final thing to note here is that as is the case with basically all classical Chinese texts, it's not written by the philosopher in whose name it stands. So the Mòzǐ is a text written in the name of a figure named Mòzǐ, who purportedly sort of had these teachings, but there's no evidence that he himself wrote it, and sort of all written in his name by people who seem mostly to just be disciples. And it was compiled over time. So as I already kind of mentioned, the triads are a kind of clear case of this, where like you kind of get compilation from 3 different sources of the same doctrines, which at least, gives us good evidence that this was a very strong school of thought, right? That sort of developed and sort of had staying power in the classical period. And so these kinds of sort of textual historical considerations are worth having in mind too when we're thinking about how to resolve this kind of problem. It's not as simple as saying, well, Mòzǐ thinks A and B, and he can't, he thinks, and these two things don't work together, when we're sort of deconstructing the idea of authorship a little bit, right? That sort of gives us a little bit more room to think about the problem. Okay, so I'm going to go through some conciliatory solutions first. So these are basically proposals to the effect that it looks like Mòzǐ is inconsistent, right? It looks like he affirms fate and then denies it, or denies fate and then affirms it. But actually, there is no inconsistency if we sort of like look hard enough or sort of massage things a bit, or as the case may be. So one proposal you might be tempted by is to say, well, imperfection, right? The fact that there's any bad thing at all, or the seeming fact that there's any bad thing at all, is just illusion, right? So the world is perfect because it's sort of made by heaven, and when bad things happen, they don't really happen. They just seem to happen. So if we sort of get a fuller view of it, or sort of see things rightly in some way, we realize all is good. Literally, all is good. So there are some passages one could point to, or sort of points in the text that could support this interpretation. So Mòzǐ says in the heaven's intent chapter, that not even a hair's tip is not heaven's doing, right? So the term doing there is wei. So maybe you've heard the term wu wei. It's maybe one of the more famous Chinese philosophical ideas, but basically wu wei, or non-doing, or not sort of deliberately making something happen, or put more positively, spontaneity, is the opposite of what heaven is doing. Okay, so heaven has a kind of plan. It sort of deliberately brings something about, creates something purposively. This is very much also can be lost in terms of teleology. So there's a kind of intent, purpose, idea, which is had in advance, and then there's a creative act that brings that about in line with that. So not even the tip of a hair is not heaven's way. So is not a deliberate creation of heaven. So that might make you think, well, okay, so if heaven is all good and everything is what heaven makes, then there can't be anything bad. Right? Right. So heaven only makes good things because heaven only desires what's beneficial for us. Mòzǐ says this again and again, that heaven's only desire is to benefit all. Right. So then here's just here's the text itself that sort of evinces this. So heaven desires righteousness, detests unrighteousness. If I do what heaven desires, heaven does what I desire too. So what I desire is blessings or luck, fortune, and misfortune is what I detest. Bad things, calamities. And then this passage, what it says that so those who follow heaven's intention, inclusively caring about each other and benefiting each other, truly get rewarded. Those who oppose heaven's intention, excluding and detesting each other, and in interaction injuring each other, truly get punished. So here we get a clear idea of what heaven wants, right? So heaven wants to care for all, to benefit all, to reward the good, and conversely then to punish those who go against that, right? To sort of rectify those cases. But this already, I mean, the very idea of punishment sort of maybe gives it away that it can't be that imperfection is illusion, right? It has to be that there is some bad thing, like actually bad thing, which merits the response of punishment, right? So it can't be that. So this interpretation, this sort of proposed solution to the problem of imperfection doesn't work. Right. So bad things do happen, right? So it can't be that it's illusion. Okay, so here's then a second proposal. So maybe we can think of heaven as imperfect. So heaven creates good, but heaven also creates bad. So heaven is sometimes benevolent, sometimes malevolent. Okay, this kind of has a straightforward critique. Heaven's malevolence is ruled out by heaven's sole desire, which is to universally benefit, right? So we talked about how heaven's only desire is to care for all, benefit all, right? And if that's the only thing heaven desires, then there's no malevolent desire that heaven has. So heaven is perfect, or at least we can't say that heaven creates bad or sort of has bad intentions. So sort of putting the imperfection onto heaven isn't going to work either, right? So imperfection can't be illusion. Imperfection can't be heaven's fault, right? Or heaven's sort of being. It has to be something else. Okay, so here now we get into sort of some of the more substantive uh, proposals, right? Proposals sort of really worth considering. So imperfection is partly our bad, right? So imperfection is partly our fault. And I'm going to first present Chris Fraser's way of what in effect Chris Fraser is saying, I think, when you sort of read him and sort of disambiguate some of the things that he's saying. So heaven doesn't prevent all bad things from happening, right? And the reason it doesn't is that it's so the reason that it doesn't prevent all bad things is because it can't. Okay. So while heaven is all powerful, heaven's agency is not limited by heaven's mere activity. So heaven is kind of split into activity, kind of mere activity, and then an agency, where the agency is deliberate minded activity, and the mere activity is a non-deliberate, non-purposive, mindless activity, right? Or we could say, natural activity. Okay. So this explains imperfection in the following way. So when bad stuff happens to us, which is not our own doing, right? When it's like through no fault of our own that we experience bad things, that's because of the non-mind part. Okay, so the non-mind part is also the non-benevolent part, the non-moral part, whereas the mind part, the agency part, is still purely benevolent, purely moral, right? So here's just a kind of illustration. Yeah. So the activity of Tian or heaven, right? We can sort of think of it as having two like meters. So there's a kind of mindless dimension or part, and then there's the minded part. So Wu Wei and Yo Wei. So like this is spontaneous, not deliberate. This is deliberate, purposive, minded, right? So this would be, so the mindless part is heaven as nature. The minded part would be heaven as person. The mindless part would be not benevolent. It would be silent. It doesn't speak. Whereas the minded part of heaven is moral and speaks. So actually, in the core triad on heaven's intention, Mòzǐ says a few times that heaven's intention speaks, and he sort of has sort of sentences where it's like we're literally hearing like the word of heaven. Not so when it comes to the mindless part of heaven, according to this proposal, right? So we have no mind, mind. Put together, they are all powerful, but individually, you're considering on their own, they sort of limit each other's power, right? So heaven's mind, heaven the person, sort of, in order to get us good things, right, has to sort of fight against this sort of mindless, wild activity, which sort of is capricious, right? So good things can happen, bad things can happen with the mindless part of heaven, the natural part, the kind of brute part of heaven. So heaven, the person, is doing the best they can, but they're limited, right? So that's why there is imperfection. So right, two reasons why there's imperfection. One, we do bad things, and so we get punished. Two, randomly bad things happen to us, right? But all of this happens due to heaven. Nope. Okay. Right. So Fraser's way of putting this point is causal pluralism. So he actually looks at the same passage where Mòzǐ gets sick and says, okay, yeah, so when Mòzǐ is saying, people get sick in many ways, you can get sick by heat and cold, you can get sick by exhaustion. If there are 100 doors and you only close one of them, how is it that a thief wouldn't break in? What Mòzǐ is saying is that there are many kinds of causes for misfortune. So there's literally you can get caught in the cold, or you can work too hard, or right? There can be many. One of them would be heaven's will, right? So that can be a reason that things happen, but there are lots of other reasons. I think, even though Fraser calls it pluralism, really, I mean, fundamentally, it would be a causal dualism, right? So in exactly the way that I've laid out here. So there would be minded causes or sort of reasons that have to do with heaven's actions. Like that's why stuff happens to us. And then there would be causes that are like brute causes, right? That have no kind of real explanation, or certainly not have an explanation in heaven's intent, right? So maybe we can give sort of physical, explanations, but we couldn't give mental or action oriented explanations, right? Or action-centric explanations. So yeah, so this kind of interpretation requires backing down the no fate view to a no fatalism view, right? So that's what the denial of fate is really saying. Right, because if it were no fate, it would be that everything is, so if there's fate, it would mean that everything is mindless. But if there's no fatalism, it means, sorry, if there is fatalism, wait, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so fatalism would mean that everything is mindless. But if there is just some fate, then it means that there's a little bit of mindlessness. So if there's no fatalism, that still allows there to be some fate, right? So that has to be the interpretation in order to reconcile it with heaven's intent. Okay. Then kind of just the last point about Fraser's interpretation. So there's this part in the Mòzǐ where Mòzǐ is talking about the way in which heaven possesses all things, or sort of has all things in it. So he says, how do we know that heaven cares about the common people of the world? By its inclusively shining light on them, or illuminating them, which can also be a kind of epistemic notion of illumination. How do we know it inclusively shines on them? By its inclusively possessing them. How do we know it inclusively possesses them? By its inclusively accepting offerings from them. So one way that we could think with Fraser about this passage is that heaven possesses all insofar as it cares about all. But insofar as heaven doesn't care, right? When we're talking about the mindless part of heaven, the world is dispossessed, right? So there's a sense in which, like, if we're sort of, so we can sort of use this passage and sort of like shoehorn it into this view where, it makes sense of both being taken care of by heaven, but then also the sense of being kind of abandoned by heaven, right? So the abandonment is this kind of dispossession that happens when something happens to you and you feel like this, that this is not an expression of heaven's care. But then that would also be balanced by this care that you do get and in getting that sort of feeling that you sort of belong to heaven, or sort of that heaven is watching over you, and this kind of idea, right? Okay, so here's now a critique of Fraser. So one is just that we've now kind of arrived back at a moral ambiguity view of heaven, which is Confucius's own view. So if Mòzǐ is supposed to be, a rival to Confucius, he's not much of a rival, at least on sort of cosmology. So we might sort of, for reasons of sort of both for like sort of understanding the actual disagreements that they were having, but then also just to sort of distinguish distinct thinkers, we might want to opt for a different interpretation if it's, all things being equal, a good one. So relatedly, heaven as a person is limited in power, where really much of the force of Mòzǐ comes from the idea that, as we already quoted, right? So not even the tip of a hair is not heaven's doing, right? So the idea that all the world is designed for us to our benefit, right? And here it's worth noting that the word for the world or everything, literally it means under heaven, right? So to be at all is to be under heaven. Everything is under heaven. So if everything is under you, you have all the power, right? You rule over all, right? And if we're then saying that, well, only part of heaven sort of has this power to create all and sort of dictate how things go, then that's sort of watering down a bit the idea that everything is under heaven, right? In the same way that we were talking about possession, right? You kind of have to then qualify things under heaven as like, well, they're under heaven's guidance some of the time, but then under heaven's non-guidance on other parts of the time. But yeah, this sort of sounds like a kind of restriction on heaven that isn't really in the spirit of what Mòzǐ was saying, which is that heaven is this all-powerful person, right? Okay, so this then leads us to another interpretation, which sort of modifies some things in Fraser. And this is the interpretation that my colleague Justin Mooney favors, or at least at this point in our collaborative work is favoring. So here again, heaven does not prevent all bad things from happening, but the reason it doesn't prevent all bad things from happening is out of benevolence, right? So whereas for Fraser, it was out of impotence, right? So the reason heaven doesn't prevent badness is that it can't. In this case, heaven doesn't prevent badness because it's the benevolent thing to do. So, right, so to put that another way, so heaven could prevent bad things from happening, but heaven doesn't. And it doesn't because it is the benevolent thing to do, to let bad things happen. Okay. So before I sort of explain a bit more about that, just a few other features about this view. So according to this view, all activity of heaven is agency, right? So we no longer have this sort of factor where like part of it is kind of non-agential and another part of it is agential. All of heaven is agential, right? No part of heaven is purposeless or mindless. Right? But then we can ask, okay, so heaven, great, all of heaven is this person, this mind. But now what about this benevolence? How benevolent must this person be? Well, for starters, it can't be that heaven's benevolence is anything less than perfect, right? And here's a kind of quick argument. If heaven is imperfectly benevolent, then heaven doesn't solely desire our benefit, but heaven solely desires our benefit, from passages we already discussed. Thus, heaven is perfectly benevolent. Okay. So, as perfectly benevolent, the allowance of bad things is all part of the perfectly benevolent plan, right? And this is the key point, sort of the key move that's made pretty much, I think, in most discussions of the problem of evil, at least in sort of Western European contexts. A world without such bads would be less good, right? So this is the key move, right? So the reason why it's okay, why heaven sort of permits these bad things, is that were it not for those bad things, you wouldn't have other good things. And so on balance, you're better off with the bad stuff than without it. Right. And even, I mean, so like right, so this is Leibniz's idea, right? That we're in the best of all possible worlds. The best of all possible worlds is one that includes suffering and badness. And you might ask Leibniz, like, really? Like, are you sure like you couldn't have just like had like all the great stuff without the bad stuff? You could ask the same thing to Mòzî's heaven, right? But we'll get to the critique in a little bit. So these bads would be our fate, right? But they come from heaven, right? So these bad things, they come from heaven, but they're not punishments, right? So they're bad things which are not our bad, right? They're bad things which are not our doing, right? Which are not of our own making. Right. So then here again, we're then required to read the no fate view as the kind of more moderate no fatalism view. Okay, but here's a critique, right? I already kind of anticipated this, sort of pre-said it. But think about all the horrific things in the world, right? Is that really for our benefit? I think we can just sort of press that basic theological point. So then, maybe we can, again, all things being equal, give a more defensible conception of Mòzî's moral cosmos, right? Which doesn't require us to sort of reinterpret all bad things, including all terrible, horrific things, as part of some divinely providential plan, right? Like I mean, so maybe this is a sort of a matter of taste or or intuition or something, but I just find something uh I don't know, disingenuous or something like that. There's something about this kind of view that I think is just it's not very satisfying. Right. To sort of just explain away all bads is just like, it's for the best, right? If you just sort of like take the long view of the universe. Um, I just don't see, I just don't see that. Um, oh yeah, okay. Okay, so now we get to my view. Um, so oh, and I realize I'm going over a little bit on time. So I'll try to go through this, not dwell on this too much. But so my view, as far as conciliatory approaches, differs from the other views in the following way. So basically, the proposals by Fraser and Mooney operate by affirming two of these conditionals, but then denying their converses. So they think, for Mòzî, if you do good stuff, you get good stuff. If you do bad stuff, then you get bad stuff. But it's not the case that when you get good stuff, that you've then done good stuff, right? And it's not the case that when you get bad stuff, that you've then done bad stuff. to deserve it, right? So they deny that part, right? So they just say there's just a one-way relation, right? So you do good, you get good, you do bad, you get bad, but not the reverse. So what I want to say is that you do get the reverse, right? So I want to affirm the kind of biconditional between doing good stuff and getting good stuff, and doing bad stuff and getting doing bad stuff and getting bad stuff, right? So according to Fraser and Mooney, Mòzǐ gets a bad thing, this illness, but it doesn't follow that he did anything bad to deserve that, right? I want to say that he did do something bad to deserve it. Okay. Where this would then be placing all imperfection on us, right? All imperfection is our doing, is our making, right? So Mòzǐ really did somehow have it coming. Okay. That's the idea. So when Mòzǐ gets sick, it's because he did something bad to deserve it. This becomes much easier to see as soon as we really take seriously Mòzǐ's consequentialism, right? So this would be this idea that specifically the only thing that makes my action good or bad is whether it in fact benefits or harms, right? So it doesn't matter what I intend to do, that I intend to benefit people. If I don't benefit them, then I did bad. Right. So then we're thinking about the passage. When Mòzǐ speaks about the many routes by which one can get sick, he's speaking metaphorically about the many ways his actions could have ended up having harmful consequences without his knowing. So it's a claim about the pervasive ignorance we have of whether what we do is actually good, and the humility we ought to thereby cultivate. So, right, so when he says, people get illness in many ways, he's saying we put ourselves out there and act, right? And what the kind of consequences and ramifications are for those actions are so many sort of branching chains of cause and effect. And those are the many routes by which you would get an illness. So you might have done something that for all the world seemed like the right thing to do, but then maybe it had a bad consequence, and then you get something bad as a result of that. That's what he's saying. Right. Okay, so that ends the kind of conciliatory solutions, right? Where we sort of try to reconcile this tension. And I've suggested my own proposal where we just sort of put all the responsibility on us as the best solution of that class. But now I just want to consider some non-conciliatory solutions, right? So this would be the idea that don't try to make Mòzǐ consistent. He's inconsistent, and that's okay. So so there are only two views here, so I'll be done quick. So the first solution comes from Franklin Perkins, who wrote a book on the problem of evil in classical Chinese thought. And Perkins' idea is kind of ingenious. It's to sort of apply Mòzǐ's own doctrine evaluation to the doctrine of fate and heaven's intent. So so the thought would be, okay, there is this inconsistency where Mòzǐ is saying there can't be bad things that just happen for no reason, because everything happens for a reason. And then what Perkins says is this is just a kind of artifact of what the actual practice was of thinking and learning philosophy in general in the classical period, in classical Chinese philosophy, but especially Mòzǐ, where the idea here is that the whole point of doing philosophy isn't to arrive at like the truth, or at least that's not the aim. The aim is to improve the world. The aim is to sort of in practice have things go better. That's the goal. Now, truth is a very good expedient towards that aim, but it's not like what we're aiming at is just to get things right. What we're aiming at is to sort of have a better world. So this is shared across all classical Chinese texts. And I think what Perkins is really kind of stressing is like, what if we really took that seriously, right? What would that mean for like how we think about the writing, right? That the writing is not always claiming truth, but it sort of has a kind of practical educative function, right? Or sort of a formative function, right? So then here we look at Mòzǐ, it's primarily trying to exhort and inspire action, right? So when, so then when Mòzǐ is saying, for instance, that everything is due to heaven, he doesn't literally mean that, but he's saying something that can sort of like get you to act in the right kinds of ways. Okay, so brief critique of this. I think that we can respect the practical value of the text while also respecting the inconsistency. And I think Perkins doesn't really respect the inconsistency as much. So here we now get to my proposal, which is to respect that the inconsistency is a problem. And then we can then see why it is that after Mòzǐ, people did not take up his idea of a moral cosmos. So what I want to suggest is a kind of, speculative thesis is that it's by recognizing that there were inherent tensions in the idea of a moral cosmos, of the world being this perfect world order, that idea of the world never got any buy-in, right? So if we look at any kind of post-Moist figure, Mengzi, Laozi, Zhuangzi, Xunzi, Hanfeizi, none of them believe in a moral cosmos. But just to kind of, end with the most famous example, we have chapter 5 of the Tao Te Ching, which says, heaven and earth are not benevolent. They treat the myriad things as straw dogs. And so the sage is not benevolent. They treat ordinary people as straw dogs. So just kind of like, little things made of straw that sort of come into being and sort of come out of being. But, no more. All right, thanks.
All right. So thanks so much, Zach, for your talk. So yeah, we don't have as much time as ideally we'd have for questions and discussion, but yes, those of you who do have questions, please raise your hand and we'll take them in turn. Not seeing any hands, but I'm sure there are some questions. Maybe okay. Yes, Ayush.
Yeah, Zach, hi. So
Hi.
the problem I've been thinking, I mean, the basic premise of this problem of evil is that God exists, right? But if we look at Camus' work or, for starter, Nietzsche's work, he's just denying God because of all the evils that are happening. And then Camus comes and says that, all right, there's an absurd world where everything is happening, and we have to face that absurdity with dignity and all those stuff that he talks about. So when we deal with the problem of bad stuff happening, obviously we need to first of all define what's bad and what's good. So for example, we need to take the first premise that all right, murdering or killing is bad, genocide is bad because we don't give life, right? So it's not in our hand. And from that perspective, God becomes prominent that, okay, there is first mover in this whole cosmos, right? That is the teleological position for God to exist, that there is the first mover, and then he made the world, he gave us life and all those things. But then after that, we don't need God from moral perspective. He ends there from logical perspective, I would say. And everything that is happening might be stochastic in nature. So whatever is happening, as you just said, that the burden falls on us, that bad is because of us. Whatever is happening is because of us. Now, obviously, there might be some and anthropocentric view. This might be some anthropocentric view, but I would argue that in that context, why would we? I mean, my basic question is, why do we need God for defining morality at all? We need to define morality in other contexts, because when we use God, obviously that is defining the power structure as well, right? Because obviously if I have the faith of God and I have some, connection with God, then whatever I'm doing is word of God, and I don't I mean, whatever I'm doing, and that has been happening for time being, since historical periods, right?
Mm.
So that
True,
was my
true.
major contention, that how can we deal with morality in the absence of God, in the pure absence of God.
Sure. Well, what I was trying to do here was really interpretive or sort of explicating what Mòzǐ is saying, and Mòzǐ does think that the source of moral norms is God or heaven. So I think there is a kind of, if we're sort of placing this in contemporary discussion, contemporary debate, there is a general question of the source of moral norms. So if you say that God is not the source because there is no God, then you have to come up with some other answer. But Mòzǐ sort of occupies that conversation as saying the source is clear. It's sort of written into the sky, written into nature. We can sort of read it off nature, and that's how it is.
Okay, that was my question. Thanks.
Other questions? If not, I will ask a question. But okay, yeah, I'll go ahead and take the prerogative. So yeah, thanks so much, Zach. I found a lot of this really, really interesting. Again, very far from an expert in the area. I wanted to ask a little bit just about the way you see the distinction that you started with between the problem of evil and the problem of the moral cosmos. I mean,
Yeah.
how does this play a role in the later argument? It wasn't entirely, evident to me. I agree with you that there does seem to be, I mean, whether it's a difference in kind or just a difference in degree, certainly, yeah, there are some things that do seem to pose an especially great challenge to the idea that there could be a deity, of this sort. But yeah, I'm just wondering, sort of again, in terms of the overall strategy and the debate between these different readings of Mòzǐ, how do you think that distinction comes in, if it does at all? So that was the first question.
Yeah.
And add others, but I'll leave them for after others have a chance.
Sure. Yeah. No. So I didn't make this explicit at all towards the end, but really I think that I was only talking about the problem of imperfection, or why there's bad stuff. And I think that it would just follow that whatever solution is given, or whatever solution there is for Mòzǐ for why there's bad stuff, would also be a solution for why there's unjust suffering. And whatever lack of solution there is also a lack of solution to the problem of why there is evil.
Mm.
So I see it as pretty straightforward, just like it just follows that a solution to one would be a solution to the other, or a lack of solution to one would be a lack of solution to the other.
Mm. I guess then, just in that context, I was just wondering again, why is it important that we make this, then, that we do draw this distinction between these two problems instead of the problems.
Yeah, because I think it's just much more basic than suffering. I think
Okay.
the problem is not like why does God allow suffering? The problem is why does God allow as trivially bad things as like a bad haircut, right? Or like or like not getting enough sleep or something
Mm.
so it's really meant to be like fundamentally sort of fundamental theological work on like what is God's relation to goodness and
Yeah.
badness?
Okay. Yeah. Why are there, I don't know, prudential bads at all? I think I think that is an important a distinction to make. I think so again, I mostly am familiar with a lot of this stuff from sort of the well-being literature, and I think very often anything that isn't a welfare good is just called an evil, prudential goods and prudential evils. And but yeah, no, I see the that there are, yeah, I see the point there. Anyhow, I'll turn it over to others. Yes, Shashir, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can ask a question. Zach, thanks very much. Very interesting, Zach. Yeah, I mean, the number of views and very interesting. Zach, I'm kind of curious. I mean, I'm quite taken. I'm surprised. I want to know about this view of yours. This that imperfection is totally our bad. So
Yeah.
if I understand correctly, Zach, what you're arguing is that even when Mòzǐ gets sick, it's because he did something to deserve it. Right.
Yeah.
So from what I understand, for the evil and for the imperfections, what you are essentially arguing is that the only way we can kind of justify this is to say that you place the burden of doing bad on the individuals themselves.
Yeah.
How this? I mean, okay. What about babies, for instance? I mean, I'm sure this is an example which will come up often. But okay, fine. Mòzǐ has done something. He's lived a certain life. Okay, something that happened earlier happened now. What about? I mean, does this hold true for? I mean, for all beings, including newborn babies and things like that? Is this only anthropocentric? I mean, would you also think similarly for other creatures? I mean, or is this largely anthropocentric? I'll stop here. I mean, there are a lot of related questions that this will go on to, but I'll just pause here. Then.
Yeah. No, I mean, these are great cases that I definitely need to think through. So if I'm remembering correctly, I think there is a point where he addresses in passing, what do we say about babies? And I think he thinks it's a harm done to the family. So it would be a family that sort of bears the responsibility for that. Now, you could then still press and say, well, but the baby didn't do anything wrong. So why is it that the baby got the punishment? And I think Mòzǐ's thinking is still that there's a sense in which the baby carries on the responsibility of the family, that it sort of inherits this sin, if you like. So I think that is one thing that he could say there. When it comes to animals, he just doesn't say that they get rewarded or punished at all. So I think that he thinks, and this is sort of like there's indirect evidence for this, in that like the only time he talks about people getting rewarded or sort of doing the right thing or sort of like following what heaven wants is in the case of us. So he doesn't think that. So he thinks that everything kind of follows a kind of like natural law where like if it sort of just does its thing, it'll like naturally get what it needs. Like it'll get food, it'll get sunlight, it'll get whatever. But we're kind of this weird case where like we have to sort of have an explicit guideline that sort of helps us do that. So I think it just wouldn't apply. I think the problem wouldn't apply to non-human animals or non-human life.
All right. I mean, this of course opens up a whole bunch of other questions. Obviously, family, definition of family. What about puppies?
Right. Yeah.
So you can build this up further. But okay, but thanks very much. Yeah.
Yeah, and sorry for going over time. I realized now we don't have so much time. But...
But yeah, I think we're almost out of
Yeah,
time.
are there other questions? If there are, then maybe we can go a bit over, further over, but yeah,
I'm just gonna go on.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go on. Sure.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the way in which, so I think you mentioned that sort of in terms of your response, the Mòzǐ's consequentialism is quite important. And yeah, I mean, it's always seemed to me that the only person who has any hope of giving adequate response to the problem of evil is a consequentialist. And actually, I guess Justin Mooney's work, and I know he has articles arguing for this as well. And so, yeah, I guess I can sort of see how, again, at least, a certain kind of consequentialist could yeah, could find a way of squaring the views you're talking about here. But I don't know. I mean, maybe you could go a little bit further into the. I mean, what are the precise sort of ethical commitments here that you disagree with, for instance, the Mooney view on? Because I was interested in that sort of.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So I think my only real objection to the Mooney view is that it feels there's something cheap. It feels a little cheap to me to sort of just sweep bad things under the rug of like a divine plan. Whereas I think that one virtue of my view is that it also puts pressure on the right places, which is on your own actions, rather than just because one thing that might happen if you sort of have the providential kind of heaven's plan view is that you kind of get a mix between what could be a bad thing that's happened to you because of what you did and a bad thing that's happened to you because it's God's plan. And whereas on my view, the view I'm recommending, there wouldn't be any mixing those up because it's all you. And I think that encourages the right kind of attitude. I mean, that encourages the kind of attitude that Mòzǐ wants us to have.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I got a call and then got confused, but yeah. Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, I do agree that I think if you're a certain kind of consequentialist, it's actually quite plausible to think that, well, we've all done lots and lots of harm and lots of bad things that we could justly be blamed for. So
yeah.
I think
so I actually have a question for you. I mean, as someone who works in ethics, because so I don't work in ethics at all, and I've sort of come into this from the back door. And one thing that's always struck me about consequentialism is like a puzzle is this thing. I think it comes up in like one of the early discourses of the Buddha, where the Buddha's like, so there's this one good thing that happened. I'm kind of paraphrasing. There's like this good, like this thing that seemingly is obviously good happened. And then the Buddha was asked like, wasn't that good? And then the Buddha was like, well, just wait and see. And then like a bad thing happened to that same person. And then everyone was like, oh, like, isn't this like an unfortunate thing? And then the Buddha says, well, just wait and see. And then a good thing happens, and it goes on and on. So one where I have it here is like the indeterminacy, like the sort of absolute indeterminacy of our actions, like whether they actually do have good or bad consequences. Because it seems to me if you're saying that it has good or bad consequences, you're like arbitrarily stopping at some point. So I don't know how consequentialists answer to this.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, I think, and yeah, there have been people who have written on this issue. I mean, yeah, I mean if you given certain kinds of cosmologies, even, right? Sort of, it seems like, you know, the consequences of any particular action are sort of almost infinite, even, I mean, maybe literally infinite. And so, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think that's not anything like a problem that consequenceless of a solution to. That's just sort of a very general, issue.
I see.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I'm supposed to go to an admissions event, actually. So yeah, I should probably head, which probably means also we should wrap up. But thank you so much for joining us. It was really fascinating. And yeah, thank you everyone else for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.